What if the war was already lost? Not on the battlefield, but inside locked rooms, quiet offices, and secret reports that never reached the public. What if some men knew the truth months before the world did, but had no power to stop what was coming? In early 1943, Germany was still fighting on multiple fronts. To the outside world, the Reich appeared wounded but not defeated. Newspapers still spoke of resistance. Propaganda still promised victory. Hitler still spoke of destiny. But behind the speeches, behind the flags and marching soldiers, something had changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly. By March 1943, Germany's intelligence community was no longer asking how to win the war. They were asking something far more dangerous. How long can this last? This story does not begin on March 17th itself. It begins in the weeks before it, after a disaster so massive that it shattered illusions across Europe. Stalingrad. In February 1943, the German Sixth Army surrendered. More than 300,000 men were lost, killed, wounded, or captured. For the first time, an entire German field army had ceased to exist. On the front lines, soldiers felt it immediately. But inside intelligence circles, the impact was even deeper. Because Stalingrad was not just a military defeat, it was a mathematical one. German intelligence officers, men trained to think in numbers, logistics, production, and manpower, began re-examining everything. They looked at Soviet reserves. They looked at Allied factories. They looked at Germany's fuel situation. They looked at aircraft losses that could no longer be replaced at the same speed. And slowly, a disturbing pattern appeared. Reports from the Eastern Front indicated that Soviet forces were not collapsing, as Berlin had predicted, but growing stronger. Entire new armies were appearing where German planners believed none could exist. From Britain, neutral observers and covert sources reported something even more alarming. American industrial output was accelerating at a scale Germany could not match. Every month, the Allies were producing more aircraft, more tanks, more ships. Losses that crippled Germany were inconveniences for the Allies. Inside the Abwehr, the German intelligence service, analysts began writing differently. The language changed. Words like victory began to disappear. They were replaced with phrases like long-term sustainability and strategic imbalance. These were not emotional men. They were not defeatists. They were professionals. And professionals could see the numbers no longer added up. By early March 1943, intelligence reports arriving from neutral countries, Switzerland, Sweden, Turkey, were increasingly consistent. Different sources, different locations, same conclusion. The Allies could afford a long war. Germany could not. But knowing this was dangerous. In the Third Reich, bad news was not simply unwelcome, it was suspicious. Too much pessimism could be interpreted as sabotage, or worse, treason. So intelligence officers learned to write carefully. They avoided absolutes. They avoided direct conclusions. Instead of saying, Germany will lose, they wrote, continued offensive operations may prove unsustainable under current conditions. Everyone understood what that meant. By mid-March 1943, intelligence discussions within departments had shifted. The question was no longer whether Germany could defeat the Soviet Union outright. The question was whether Germany could survive a prolonged global war against enemies with greater resources, manpower, and industrial depth. March 17, 1943, would later stand out not because something dramatic happened that day, but because by then the realization had already formed. That realization was simple, cold, and terrifying. This war was becoming unwinnable. Not because German soldiers lacked courage, not because commanders lacked experience, but because time itself was now the enemy, and time was not on Germany's side. In Berlin, Hitler prepared for new offensives. Plans were being drawn for a decisive battle in the east. Faith was being placed in one final blow that would change everything. But inside intelligence offices, men stared at reports they could not ignore. They understood something fundamental had shifted. Victory was no longer a question of strategy. It was a question of reality. And reality was beginning to speak louder than ideology. This was the atmosphere. This was the mindset. This was the silence before March 17, 1943. In the next part, we will follow the intelligence streams that converged on that day, and why some German spies realized the truth, even if they could never say it out loud. March 17, 1943, did not begin with a meeting. There was no dramatic announcement, no declaration of defeat. Instead, it began the same way most dangerous realizations do, with paper. Reports arriving quietly, typed summaries placed on desks, folders marked confidential moving from hand to hand. By this point, German intelligence was fragmented, cautious, and deeply afraid of itself. The Abwehr was officially responsible for military intelligence, but it was no longer trusted. The SS ran its own intelligence networks. The Foreign Office gathered diplomatic assessments. Economic offices tracked production and raw materials. These groups did not always cooperate. But in mid-March 1943, something unusual happened. Their conclusions began to match. From Switzerland came assessments based on Allied financial flows and industrial contracts. Neutral bankers, businessmen, and observers reported that American war production was not peaking, it was accelerating. Aircraft output figures were revised upward. Shipbuilding numbers were no longer estimates, they were confirmed. Even conservative calculations showed a future Germany could not outproduce. From Sweden, information flowed about raw materials, iron ore shipments, oil logistics, transportation bottlenecks. The picture was grim. Germany's access to critical resources was shrinking, while Allied access was expanding. Meanwhile, reports from the Eastern Front painted an even darker reality. Contrary to earlier German assumptions, the Red Army had not exhausted its reserves at Stalingrad. Instead, new formations were appearing behind the front lines. Intelligence officers noticed patterns. Fresh divisions arriving faster than expected. Equipment improving, not deteriorating. Command coordination becoming more effective. This was not the Soviet Union Germany had planned to destroy in 1941. It was something else, and now it was learning. On March 17th, analysts within the Abwehr compiled multiple streams of information into internal summaries. These documents did not declare defeat. They didn't need to. The conclusions were implicit. Germany was fighting enemies whose strength increased over time. Germany's own strength declined the longer the war continued. This was the definition of a losing equation. One senior intelligence officer reportedly described the situation using a single phrase in a closed discussion. This is no longer a war of maneuver, it is a war of arithmetic. Arithmetic had no ideology. It did not care about speeches or faith. It only counted. Aircraft losses versus production, fuel consumption versus supply, manpower casualties versus replacements, and the numbers were unforgiving. At the same time, reports reached Berlin regarding Allied coordination. American and British forces were no longer operating as loosely connected partners. They were synchronizing strategy, production, and logistics. This meant something deeply troubling for German planners. Even if Germany won a major battle, even if it inflicted heavy losses, the Allies could absorb those losses. Germany could not. March 17, 1943 became a symbolic point because by then, intelligence officers no longer needed new evidence. The existing data had crossed a threshold. Every new report confirmed what earlier ones suggested. And yet, none of this translated into policy. Because intelligence in Nazi Germany existed to inform leadership, it existed to confirm beliefs. Hitler distrusted intelligence that contradicted his worldview. He believed intuition mattered more than analysis. He believed willpower could overcome material disadvantage. And, perhaps most importantly, he believed those who spoke of limits lacked faith. So intelligence officers learned a dangerous skill: how to warn without warning. Reports were phrased carefully. Negative conclusions were buried under technical language. Pessimism was disguised as risk assessment. Even then, some reports were ignored entirely. Others were intercepted by rival agencies before reaching decision-makers. March 17th was not the day Hitler learned the war was lost. It was the day intelligence professionals understood that their knowledge no longer mattered. They could see the trajectory, they could calculate the outcome, but they could not change the direction. Inside Germany's intelligence community, morale shifted quietly. Not toward surrender, not toward rebellion, but toward resignation. Men continued to work, continued to analyze, continued to report. But the question changed. Instead of asking, "How do we win?" they began asking, "How long can this be delayed?" Some believed a negotiated peace might still be possible if the war ended soon. Others knew that by 1944, even negotiation would be impossible. What united them was this understanding: time was no longer neutral, it was actively hostile. Every month favored the Allies, every delay weakened Germany's position further. Yet outwardly, nothing changed. Propaganda intensified, promises grew more extreme, new decisive weapons were hinted at. But intelligence officers had learned to distrust miracles. They had seen too many calculations, too many charts, too many irreversible trends. March 17, 1943 did not end the war. It did not even change German strategy. But it marked the moment when knowledge and power fully separated. Those who understood the war could not control it. Those who controlled the war refused to understand it. And in that gap, the future was decided. In the next phase of this story, we will follow what happened after this realization. How Hitler responded not with retreat, but with escalation, and why the choices made after March 1943 ensured that Germany's defeat would not only happen, but be total. The problem for Germany after March 1943 was not ignorance, it was refusal. Inside intelligence offices, the situation was understood. Inside Hitler's inner circle, it was rejected. Hitler did not deny the numbers because he did not see them. He denied them because accepting them would mean accepting limits. And Hitler had built his entire worldview on the belief that limits did not apply to him. To Hitler, history was not shaped by factories or fuel reserves. It was shaped by will. And will, he believed, could bend reality. When intelligence summaries reached the highest levels, they were filtered. Warnings were softened. Negative projections were reframed as temporary difficulties. Those who pushed too hard found themselves removed, sidelined, or accused of lacking faith. By late March 1943, the atmosphere in Berlin had become tense in a different way. Not panicked, not chaotic, but increasingly detached. Hitler's focus had shifted almost entirely to one idea, a decisive counterstroke in the east. The coming battle, what would later be known as Kursk, was meant to restore initiative, destroy Soviet reserves, and prove that Germany still controlled the pace of the war. Intelligence officers quietly disagreed. Their reports showed that Soviet defenses were deeper than ever before. Minefields layered behind minefields, reserves positioned far beyond German reach. But these assessments clashed with Hitler's belief that the Red Army was nearing exhaustion. To Hitler, hesitation was betrayal, delay was weakness, so warnings were ignored. Inside the Abwehr, some officers began to understand a second truth, even darker than the first. Not only was the war likely lost, but the leadership would ensure it was lost in the worst possible way. Instead of conserving strength, Germany was preparing to gamble everything. March turned into April. Spring brought movement on all fronts. Allied bombing intensified over German cities. Factories were hit, repaired, hit again. Intelligence reports tracked damage and recovery times. They showed a troubling trend. Repairs were taking longer, while Allied bombing accuracy was improving. Air superiority was beginning to shift. On the Eastern Front, German units reported growing Soviet confidence. The Red Army was no longer reacting, it was planning. And still, Hitler pressed forward. He increasingly distrusted his generals. He increasingly distrusted intelligence. But he trusted one thing completely, his own intuition. This growing gap between information and decision-making had consequences. Officers stopped arguing. Reports became formalities. Warnings were submitted, then mentally discarded. The system continued to function, but meaning was lost. By late March 1943, some intelligence officers privately acknowledged something they would never write down. Even a German victory at Kursk would not reverse the overall balance of power. At best, it would delay the inevitable. At worst, it would accelerate collapse by wasting irreplaceable resources. This realization created a quiet psychological fracture. Men continued to serve the state, but belief was gone. They were no longer working toward victory, they were working within a machine they knew could not stop. When the Battle of Kursk began in July 1943, intelligence officers watched carefully, not with hope, but with confirmation. And confirmation came quickly. German forces encountered defenses on a scale never seen before. Losses mounted, momentum slowed. What followed was not immediate defeat, but strategic paralysis. From that moment onward, Germany would never regain the initiative in the East. For intelligence professionals, this was the final proof. March 17th had been the realization, Kursk was the validation, and now a third truth emerged, perhaps the most dangerous of all. If Germany could no longer win, then the nature of the war would change. It would become a war not of victory, but of endurance, a war of delay, a war fought to avoid collapse rather than achieve success. Hitler responded to this shift not by seeking an exit, but by demanding total commitment, total war, total mobilization, total sacrifice. Youth were called up, older men were recalled, industry was reorganized under emergency measures. Intelligence officers recognized the irony. These steps increased Germany's ability to fight longer, but they also confirmed that normal victory was no longer expected. The Reich was preparing not to win, but to survive. And survival itself was becoming uncertain. By late 1943, Allied landings in Italy confirmed what intelligence had predicted months earlier. Germany was now fighting on multiple collapsing fronts. Resources were stretched, air defenses were overwhelmed, the Eastern Front continued to bleed. Looking back, many intelligence officers later described March 1943 as the moment clarity arrived, but paralysis followed. They knew, they understood, but they could not act. And so the war continued, driven not by strategy, but by denial. In the next part, we will move forward into the final phase of this realization, how intelligence warnings became irrelevant, how Hitler doubled down on fantasy, and how the choices made after this point ensured that when defeat came, it would be absolute. The final phase of the war did not arrive with a single collapse. It arrived with exhaustion. By late 1943, Germany was still fighting, still issuing orders, still mobilizing, but the character of the war had changed completely. What intelligence officers had predicted in March was now visible everywhere. The Reich was no longer shaping events, it was reacting to them. Every front demanded reinforcements that did not exist. Every crisis required resources that could not be replaced. Allied bombing campaigns intensified with relentless precision. Cities that once symbolized industrial power became landscapes of smoke and rubble. Intelligence reports tracked production figures month by month. Despite heroic efforts, output could not keep pace with destruction. Aircraft factories were dispersed underground. Labor shortages worsened. Fuel became more valuable than ammunition. The numbers continued to speak clearly, and now even denial struggled to silence them. In early 1944, Allied forces landed in Italy and pushed northward. German intelligence had warned that Italy could not be held indefinitely. Once again, the warnings were correct. At the same time, preparations for a Western invasion became impossible to ignore. From neutral sources, intercepted communications, and aerial reconnaissance, intelligence officers pieced together the picture. A landing in France was coming. The only unknown was where and when. Hitler obsessed over deception. He expected trickery everywhere. Intelligence assessments suggested Normandy was a real possibility. Others argued for Pas-de-Calais. Hitler chose to believe what suited him. When Allied forces finally landed in June 1944, the response was slow, divided, and confused. By then, the intelligence system had become paralyzed by fear and fragmentation. Reports arrived, but decisions lagged. The invasion did not fail because German soldiers lacked courage. It failed because the system had lost coherence. From that moment onward, defeat was no longer theoretical. It was operational. On the Eastern Front, Soviet advances accelerated. Entire German armies were destroyed or forced into retreat. Intelligence officers stopped counting victories. They counted days. By late 1944, internal reports openly described the situation as critical, language that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Even Hitler's closest circle could no longer fully deny reality, yet surrender was never considered. Because for Hitler, defeat was not merely military, it was existential. Admitting loss would mean admitting the failure of his worldview. So the war continued. Orders became more extreme, punishments harsher, fantasy replaced planning. Intelligence agencies were increasingly ignored or used only to confirm pre-existing beliefs. By early 1945, Germany was collapsing from within. Fuel shortages immobilized divisions, rail networks disintegrated, civilian morale shattered. And still, Hitler spoke of final resistance. Inside intelligence offices, there was no longer debate, only documentation. They recorded the end as it unfolded. When Allied forces crossed into Germany itself, the meaning of March 17, 1943, became unmistakable. That had been the moment when the future was visible, but refused. Now there was no refusing it. Berlin fell not as a surprise, but as a confirmation. For those who had studied the numbers, the collapse followed the logic they had outlined years earlier. In the end, Germany did not lose because it lacked intelligence. It lost because it rejected it. The war was not decided by a single battle. It was decided when reality was replaced by belief. March 17, 1943 did not end the war, but it marked the moment when the outcome became irreversible. From that day forward, everything else was delay. Delay measured in cities destroyed, in lives lost, in choices denied. History would later remember the speeches, the battles, the final collapse. But inside quiet rooms, among men who read reports instead of slogans, the ending had already been written. Not with drama, not with emotion, but with numbers. And numbers, once ignored, always return. This was not the story of a single day. It was the story of a truth seen too late, and a war that continued long after it was already lost. If you stayed until the end, you understand something many never will. History is not shaped only by those who speak the loudest, but by those who recognize reality, even when no one listens. Subscribe for more stories where the past is examined, one decision at a time.